coming. This is the biggest meeting we've had for catalogers. Introduce Armin. Armin has a Ph.D. in Old Testament from Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. In the past, he has taught courses in biblical studies and religious studies at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Ontario, the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon, and Drury University in Springfield, Missouri, and Emory University. He has been a cataloger at the Pitts Theology Library in Emory University since 2001, and he's been the head of cataloging since 2007. He works primarily with German and Latin language materials, including the Pitts Theology Library's German Reformation collection. He's an active member of the Society of Biblical Literature and of ATLA, where he's chair of the Technical Services Interest Group. During the RDA testing period last year, he served as chair of the RDA test group at Emory, which is one of the official test sites in the United States. So please give Armin a warm welcome as he brings the relevant knowledge and practical hands-on experience of RDA cataloging to us as theology librarians and pertaining to this historical moment in library profession.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me here. It's beautiful here. I've never been to this part of Philadelphia before. This is really quite lovely. This morning I'd like to talk a little bit in general about some issues that concern catalogers, or that would be of interest to catalogers who are encountering with RDA. How many of you have worked with RDA or have looked at the toolkit just so I have an idea? My presentation is fairly basic. I'm not planning to get into a lot of detail. I found that on a lot of listservs, the discussions tend to be very detail-oriented. There was one 2 weeks ago about establishing the proper authority heading for Dr. Snoopy versus Snoopy, and I think this is not really the thing that's going to make RDA stand or fall. At least I hope not. So I'm not going to get into that kind of granularity. So this morning I'll be talking mostly about issues that would concern catalogers. This afternoon will be a somewhat more broader and conceptual. There'll be a little bit of overlap, but fairly little. And then tomorrow, of course, we have a workshop where we'll do some exercises and actually get to work with some RDA rules. The workshop tomorrow will be based on training material provided by the Library of Congress. I attended a couple of training sessions there as part of ATLA last year, and I've adapted it for people interested in theological librarianship. But all of you work in theological libraries, I assume. Very good. So I entitled this RDA ACR2 FRBR Fervor OMG Rate of RDA. And I wanted to start with a, if this works. Here. A quote. Still, I cannot help thinking that the golden age of cataloging is over. Any guess as to who the author of that quote? It was Charles Scudder, indeed. And he said it in 1904. The occasion for this quote was, in fact, the introduction of the card catalog. It's something to, it's something to keep in mind. I think as catalogers, we tend to be conservative creatures. We like rules. And that's a good thing. Obviously, we want authorized access points, we want to follow the rules, we want to do proper descriptions. But I think changes are also a good thing. As with any change, I think there is a certain amount of disruption to be expected. My own feeling, and I'm just going to say this up front, my own feelings with RDA is that the disruption will probably be less than some of the doomsayers are predicting. But we shall see. So RDA is a new cataloging code to replace AACR2. When people first started talking about RDA, it actually was called AACR3, but it was the discovered fairly quickly that this is not the way to go. AACR2 is a, well, as you know, wonderful artifact. It's very impressive, it is very complex. And to add to it really would be patchwork, I think. But we find ourselves in a very new situations. Many of us catalog materials that are no longer just exclusively print-based. And perhaps even more importantly, all of us work in an environment that is digital. We catalog on computers. And I don't think that AACR2 really took that into consideration in its development, and a mere revision of that, I'm not sure would have gone quite far enough. At least that's what the people who developed RDA felt. Secondly, RDA is a content standard. This is something that I really can't emphasize enough. This will become clearer with my next slide when I talk about what RDA is not. It is a content standard. It's talking about the data that should go into our bibliographic records. And finally, it is designed to be used online. One of the things that I found when people started talking about RDA was, they said, well, I started reading RDA. It's like, oh, good Lord. And I understand why somebody would develop a more hostile attitude towards RDA if you try to read it. It's a futile exercise, I think, if you try to understand RDA by reading it cover to cover. It wasn't designed to be read cover to cover. It's also a painful experience, I think. It's very complex, but I sort of see it like if you move to a new city and you want to be able to find phone numbers, you get a phone book, but you don't have to read the phone book cover to cover to use it. You just have to be able to use the phone book. It's alphabetically arranged, it has a predictable structure as RDA does. And I really found that a lot of the anxiety that people have about RDA is often based on their attempt to read RDA. So I would like to encourage you not to do it. I know there's a print edition available, and there are ways of using the print edition strategically. I will talk a little bit more about this toward the end of this presentation. RDA is not a display standard. AACR2 was very, very closely wedded to ISBD standards, punctuation. Library of Congress will continue to use those standards, but that is independent of RDA. RDA does not, in fact, prescribe display, punctuation, and such things. I think that's very important, and I think that also allows for greater possibilities in cataloging and greater adaptability of the data that we put into bibliographic records. Secondly, it is not an encoding standard. RDA is not wedded to MARC. Most of us work with MARC. I know I do. It's what I know best, and what I will continue to work in even with RDA. Library of Congress will continue to work with MARC. But RDA, the rules in RDA are not limited to MARC 21, but could be applied to Dublin Core, could be applied to mods, nets, and so on, DATs if you're an archivist. You can do RDA in an XML encoding schema. And I think that's where some of the greatest potential of RDA lies. That it can go beyond MARC. And it will make data contained in a MARC format potentially more translatable and transferable to other formats. Library catalogs can actually start talking to other metadata systems. I'm very excited about this. So I think those are two very important points to emphasize. This is what RDA is not, and I'm glad it's not, because this opens up a lot of great possibilities. So RDA is based on, actually let me talk a little bit about the structure first. The structure of RDA, and I will come back to this at the end when I talk about the RDA toolkit. I've got a couple of screenshots, and I actually have RDA up if you want to look at it, or if we want to search something together perhaps, we can We can do that at the end of this presentation, but let me just give you a brief outline. As you remember, or as you know, AACR2 is based on format, chapter for format, and so on. RDA is really organized quite differently. It's got a general introduction. It identifies elements, entities, and their attributes. You know, this is some of the new speak, some of the new vocabulary that comes in with RDA that's really more helpful in describing what we do. This will become clearer as I talk more about these things. And relationships. AACR2 is a very linear work and is really concerned with cataloging what RDA would call manifestations. We've got a number of manifestations cataloged, but how manifestations, books, publications, or CDs, DVDs, whatever, how they relate to each other is not really addressed in AACR2. It is very, very central to RDA, and I think that's where some of the, also another great potential lies for RDA relationships. And then it's got a number of very good appendices on capitalization, abbreviations, presentations. It does include an appendix here, you see an ISBD mark. So it does include some rules about how to apply this to display standards, but it doesn't actually prescribe these display standards. It says if you want to use RDA with MARC, this is what you should do. If you want to use RDA with ISBD punctuation rules, this is what you should do. But it's in the appendices. And relationship designators. This again expands on, it provides control vocabulary to define relationships. For example, if you talk about a work that is an adaptation of another work, you can put that in a 7XX field. I think again, this really opens up some possibilities. So you see, it's really quite different from the way AACR2 was structured, which was very linear, chapter per format, and so on. This is really much more interested in element and how these elements relate to each other. Much more comparable to the web environment in which we've all been working for years. So, the logic behind RDA is fervor, functional requirements for bibliographic resources, also FRAD, functional requirements for authority data, and currently functional requirements for subject. I don't know what the exact acronym for that is being worked and will be added to RDA when it becomes available, should be another year or two. You've probably all heard of fervor. It's one of those terms that's being tossed around a lot. Let me just review it in a fairly general way. Another great acronym, WENI. Oh, I went too far. Sorry. There it is. I don't know why I did that. Work, expression, manifestation, and item. This is the basic structure of fervor. And really the best way to understand it is by using an example. The work, it's sort of a platonic idea, the work. An idea conceived in somebody's head, a creative thought, like Augustine's Confessions. It finds an expression in Confessiones, the original Latin that the Confessions were written in. Confessions, I think I've got the English on the left, Bekenntnisse, the German translation of it. Next to it, a critical edition, if there was any translation essentially, or any abridgment perhaps would be an expression. A way in which the work is, well, expressed. One level further down is the manifestation. This is what we have been, as catalogers, what we have been dealing with, what we have been cataloging, and what we will continue to catalog, largely. We will still be largely dealing with manifestations with RDA. We'll simply start to think differently about those elements and include other elements that relate to the work and the expression. The manifestation would be the Penguin Classics edition of the Confessions, or an audio Waters edition from 1950 or a Leipzig edition from 1934. These are all manifestations of the same critical edition. It's essentially what is published. Finally, there's the item, and that is the actual physical copy on the shelf. Copy 1, copy 2, copy autographed by editor, copy 2 of the critical edition. The actual book that you hold in your hand that you can use to kill bugs with, or throw at co-workers, or this is the item. And of course, you've got many items within one manifestation. Does that make sense? How the structure breaks down? It's a good acronym to keep in mind: WEMI, word, expression, manifestation, and item. If there are any questions, by the way, feel free to interrupt me at any time. To use another example, the Gospel of Matthew is a work, would be classified as a work. We think of it as a uniform title in AACR2. In RDA, that kind of terminology is not necessarily useful. There are different ways of thinking about it. And again, I'll get into that. But it is a work. Another work related to it, this is where the relators come in, is Pier Pasolini's movie from 1964, Il Vangelo secondo Matteo. Actually, a case could be made that it is an expression because Pasolini used only the words used in the Gospel of Matthew in his movie. So it is, in fact, an audiovisual version of the book. It becomes a little tricky here. This is where cataloger's judgment comes in. I would still view it as a separate work, seen as an adaptation of the word of the Gospel of Matthew. Because it does add a lot of visual images, of course. But as far as the actual text is concerned, the entire text in the Italian translation is contained in Pasolini's movie, no more, no less. So it's interesting. This one could be a debated point, which is why I wanted to include it. Expressions of this would include a Greek edition, the original Greek, Evangelium Katamatayon, Matthäus Evangelium, a German translation, and of course the English Gospel of Matthew. These would all be expressions. Expressions themselves are not concrete items yet, but they are ways in which the work, I don't want to say takes form, because it doesn't really become concrete until it enters the manifestation level. But the manifestation would be the publication by Daniel Barrington's The Gospel According to Matthew, which also includes a commentary, but also the entire text, or a DVD release of Pasolini's film in 2007. Of course, this manifestation would relate to this work. The item, finally, is the book on your bookshelf or the DVD in your media center. Any questions about? Yes?
Help me out with expressions. I'm having a hard time getting out of the AACR. Give me a little bit more.
I think the best way of thinking about expression are different translations. It is the same work, but it is also different because the translations differ, even though the concepts, the idea behind it is the same. Yeah. The work really is the most abstract concept, the most platonic, so to speak. The expression is, yeah. Translations are often a good way of thinking about it, or abridgment. An abridgment. It's the same thought, the same word behind it, but it is not really the same expression as a full, unabridged text.
Thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Would you think that also the original edition, what the guy had in his head, like that's how it was first expressed?
The manuscript that he first wrote down. he started writing it down, it became a manifestation. But the idea behind it was the work. And sometimes the boundaries between words and expressions are fuzzy. They can be fuzzy. That's true. And sometimes you will find the same work or expression expressed in or relating to it, presenting information in the same field. So again, it can become a little fuzzy here, but still clearer than I think ACR2 would. Yes.
With manifestations, I've heard it said that in a sense they're almost abstract also, because if you were to take all the editions of, let's say, the gospel from liturgical press and wrap them all together, then you have the manifestation, in the sense that we're not, while we do describe at that level, we can't really see other people's, we just assume that other people's copies in other libraries are the same. The item is the real physical.
Right.
Is that correct?
Yes,
That way?
yes,
Okay.
that is correct. Yeah, the item. Yeah, the only concrete and physical thing really is the item. It's the only thing you can throw in a cold. You can't throw a manifestation. You can quote a manifestation. Right. But yeah, that's true. Sorry.
Is another way of saying it, and I'm still thinking about this original edition. If the content of the original edition, not on paper yet, would that be the expression? You're still on his head?
That would be the work. I would think that would be the work. That would be the work. The ideas.
Yeah. I get work and I get manifestation, I guess I'm not getting expression.
I can see that. Like I said, there are some fuzzy boundaries, but maybe it'll become a little clearer as we talk more about it. But we can come back to this point. That is really important. Yes.
With for most books, I mean, these are examples where it's written, produced about, okay, but say you just have one book, one person's idea, he wrote it one time, there's one edition, what would that look like in this?
It would be very straightforward. You would have the manifestation, which is the publication of that book. You would have a single work, which is the idea behind the book, and the title of the work and the title of the manifestation would be identical.
Okay, so then the item would just be your personal copy.
Right, exactly, yeah. And you would pretty much have the same information in all of these. You would have more information in the manifestation because you would have information relating to publication, for example. But yeah, that's one thing I should perhaps mention, that there aren't really separate catalog records for works, expressions, manifestations, and items. You have one catalog record which contains manifestation information, work information, expression information, and perhaps even item information. Holding records, item records, and so on. So we're not dealing with 4 different mark records here. It's really all within the same, but different fields that address different issues. The 240, for example, would address an expression or a work. The 245 would identify a manifestation. And if there's only one, the 245 and the 240 would be identical. So you really wouldn't need to include a 240. If you break it down that way, the actual work that we do is not all that different with RDA than it is with AAC. It's just a different way of thinking about what we do. But our day-to-day work is probably not going to change that drastically, I think. But yes.
Aren't you going to need something, though, to act as a sort of a uniform record for an expression somewhere, so that we know that we are truly dealing with manifestations of that expression? For instance, the current authority record, which establishes a particular heading for this author, this work, and we now know that we can construct a uniform title based off of that in the manifestation record. So really, we're going to need some kind of a separate record to create the authority.
Yes, authority records, yes. Yeah, the authority record would be a separate.
So to a certain extent, we are going to have to make a different kind of record than we've been making before.
Right. Right, that is true. I was thinking of no different bibliographic records. Like, yes, different records, absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I should have been more specific, that's true. Good point, thank you. Oh, did you have a question?
If you have two different translations in the same language, like two different English translations of War and Peace, say, but they're still equal as expressions, even though they're both English, so they're kind of, okay.
So to use another example, perhaps, different Bible translations would be expressions. The work is the Bible. Different expressions would be the King James Version, the New Revised Standard Version, the English Standard Version, and so on. All of these would be on the expression level. The manifestation level would be the publication of any one of these. And then the item is what you would pick up and read.
And so is there a way to express that hierarchy, the way a uniform title would have like 240 English and then the translation?
Yes, yeah. Yeah, in this case you would have it in the 130. But yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sometimes a finished RDA record doesn't always look all that radically different from an AACR2 record. That was one of the interesting realizations after the RDA test. We did a usage test and asked users to compare AACR2 titles and RDA records, sorry, AACR2 records and RDA records of the same title, the same manifestation. And people didn't often find all that much of a difference. So one has P period, the other one has pages. Most patrons aren't going to get too upset about that or even notice it for that matter, but it really is a different way of thinking about organizing information. And when we're talking about print resources, again, it's not going to change all that drastically much. It just opens up more possibilities. Okay, one more thing about the conceptual framework. There it is. I talk about relationships. RDA is concerned with three groups of entities. One is the product of intellectual and artistic endeavor, which is many work, expression, manifestations, an item. The second group of entities would be those responsible for the intellectual or artistic content. This would be something close to what we would find in the 100 field, 700 field, 110, 710, or in an authority record, a personal authority record, for example. And finally, we have subjects. So this relates, the first relates to fervor, the second relates to FRAD, functional requirements for authority data. Subjects relates to the functional requirements for subject data, which is currently being developed and will be added to RDA. But subject headings are not considered core. But, so we're still dealing with author, title, subject. We think about it in a slightly different way. Does that make sense?
So the radical change won't really happen until ILS is changing the structure.
I think as soon as Library of Congress makes a decision, I think most ILS vendors will probably work fairly quickly to utilize the advantages offered by that. Iconic representations, for example, of specific informations. There are some fields which are data that doesn't really mean that much to a user, like the 336, 337, 338. I'll talk about those in a little bit. The user sees those and wouldn't really know what to do with them. But in an ILS, you could have iconic representations of this is a book, this is an audio CD, and so on. So yeah, but we have to wait for ILSs to catch up. There's, yeah, okay. I'll leave it at that. Relationships. I mentioned it's all about relationships. And AACR2, as I mentioned, is a largely linear system and is largely concerned with individual keep in mind that the basic organizational principle behind AACR2 is still the card catalog. You have a shelf list, you have a list of library cards lined up, but very little interaction between these. Ferber and Frad are concerned with the relationships between these components. And yeah, to utilize that, this is where the ILS, where ILSs would really come in, and OPACs especially, as they present the information to the user. Yeah. A lot of these concepts are concepts that the computer world and web designers have been working with for quite a few years. And so it should be fairly easy to adapt this to a new technological context for libraries. In a way, we're catching up with what the computer world's been doing for the past 20 years. I think. This is a diagram you may have seen. It's complicated. Little pun on the relationship status here. Actually, it's not all that complicated, but it's actually a fairly well-organized way of describing a complicated situation. I think the situation of describing information can be complicated, and this is really a fairly straightforward or effective way of capturing a complex situation. You have the three entities that I talked about: work, expression, manifestation, item, and you see how they relate. The work is realized through expression, is embodied through a manifestation, is exemplified by an item. And you have group 2 entities: person, family, corporate body. And you have subjects, group 3 entities: concepts, objects, events, places. All of these ideas relate to each other in certain ways. I don't think any of us would have this diagram in mind as we catalog a book. But I think it's a good representation, or a CD, I shouldn't say book, because one of the big things about RDA is that we move beyond mere print representations. But I think it's a good way of visualizing what we in fact do, even if we don't think about it in that way. It's like breaking down the processes in your brain when you're walking. You don't think about walking, you walk. But if you think about it, it would actually be a fairly complex process. Again, this is what we do in cataloging, and this is a good way of representing it, even though we don't necessarily think about it in this way. But I think each one of these components makes sense to a certain extent, or makes, not just to a certain extent, is quite logical. Now, looking at this, and this again comes back to your question, Donna, for bibliographic systems to fully support user tasks, metadata has to be very clear about what entities and relationships are being described. If we want to achieve this level of complexity that you saw in the diagram, we have to be very clear about what components describe what entities and what relationships. And AACR2 is kind of muddy about that. Looking at the 245, for example, I mean, this is probably the most basic field of a MARC record. You can't have a MARC record without a 245. We have subfield A relating to the title, it's the manifestation. The remainder of the title, well, okay, we're not quite sure. It's really also the manifestation, I suppose. Things like inclusive dates or bulk dates relate to the work. The medium, the GMD, electronic resource, microphone, that sort of thing, relate to the work. Sorry, the manifestation. The form of the work relates to the work. The version relates to the expression. All of these are possible subfields in a 245 field, but they all relate to different structural components of the information that we're trying to capture. if it doesn't, perhaps that's a good thing because it shows how muddy this is, how unclear or imprecise AACR2 rules address the complexities of the relationships of constituent elements to each other. Somewhat clear way of thinking about it is, I think RDA, on the left you actually have a screenshot from the RDA table of contents. RDA builds further concepts into the guidelines for descriptions and access points. The language, the organization, and the identification of data elements with further entities are all part of RDA. These considerations, or the way of organizing information in this way, was not contained or addressed by AACR2. So the information architecture is addressed by RDA, is part of RDA. Yes?
Got kind of a devil's advocate question.
Mm-hmm.
Because the 245 for a book at least is built on the title page, so if you're looking through a database to try to find a match, it's very concrete and very clear.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not, so I'm not quite sure, how this would relate to that. You see what I'm saying? In terms of, from a very pragmatic standpoint, if you had an RDA cataloging record, would the relationship to the, to the manifestation you've got in front of you be equally clear?
With AACR2, you would have different formats described, and you would read about the description of each format and each chapter. Here in RDA, you would have the description of the preferred title. And that description, or the rules for those descriptions, can be applied to any different format. So there's a somewhat greater flexibility and interrelatability, if that makes sense. I don't know if that addresses your question.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
It might become a little clearer when we look at some screenshots of RDA. I'm going to do a comparison of AACR2 and RDA. It's what I've been talking about all along, but I want to do some side-by-side comparisons as well. AACR2 was originally produced in print format and was produced to be read in print format. RDA was not. It was meant to be online, used online. In fact, the print version was a rather awkward afterthought. Initially, it wasn't supposed to be released as a print version, but it's a cost factor. Obviously, subscription to the toolkit costs money, and it's easier for some libraries with limited budgets to spend $150 for the print version of RDA rather than to maintain a continuous subscription. So it's really a cost factor. That's why it was released. AACR2 has a linear approach. RDA is a non-linear approach. It's a more web-like approach, the sort of thing that I put up when I did the relationship diagram. AACR2 emphasizes display, and that is one thing that RDA deliberately does not want to do. It emphasizes content rather than display. So content can be displayed in different ways, and that makes RDA records more adaptable. There are some changes in vocabulary ACR2 talked about entries. RDA refers to access points. ACR2 talked about headings. RDA talks about authorized access points. We speak about creators rather than author, composer, etc. Again, you see, because creator can really apply to a number of different ways in which somebody can be responsible for the intellectual content of the work, expression, or manifestation. ACR2 talked about the main entry. RDA talks about the preferred title and authorized access points, if available. Broadens the scope a little bit. It allows you to do a little more in terms of finding information, for example, for publication information. If you know a book was published in St. Louis, Missouri, and this is mentioned in the preface, you could put this into 300. You wouldn't have to use square brackets to do so. You have preferred access points, authorized access points. Again, for a uniform title, we have a preferred title. This would describe the expression or conventional collective title. Some notable changes in RDA that we can expect. And these are some of the details, and I don't want to get very granular here, but some notable changes are you have much more exact transcription. Abbreviations are used only if they appear on the item itself. Take what you see. If the title page has an abbreviation, if it says Tulsa, Oklahoma, you put Tulsa, Oklahoma in the 260. If it says Tulsa, OK, you put Tulsa, OK, but you wouldn't supply the abbreviation if it doesn't say that. Yes?
In this way, it's moving in the direction of wearable cataloging. So wearable cataloging is, those rules are pretty much exact transcription. And in a lot of ways, it's easier because you don't have to remember the abbreviation and go to back to ACR2 and check it. All of these things. It's simpler.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, I mean, it should be easier. It removes ambiguities, and a lot of what I do is wearable cataloging. Maybe that's why I like this. It seems like a very natural role to me. Yeah, it removes ambiguities. It also facilitates machine-readable workflows. Now, some people might consider that good. Some people might have questions about this. Obviously, records produced with machine-readable technology are not always great records. If you see the number 3, level 3 record in OCLC, you know what I'm talking about. But it facilitates that kind of workflow. You can scan a title page, you can run OCR software on it, break it down, and then have a cataloger go through it and identify the elements, verify that they're all in the right place rather than typing them all. So it could help us speed up our work to some extent. Sick has died. If there's a, it was sick, now it's dead. If there's a typo or spelling mistake on the title page in the title, you transcribe the mistake as it is. And you offer a 246 with the corrected version, but you wouldn't interrupt the title statement with sick in square brackets. Again, this follows the idea of take what you see. Titles of nobility, honor, etc. are no longer permitted. We include those if they are on the title page or the preferred title source. We do include them. Again, all based on the principle of take what you see. The use of vernacular, there are no more Latin abbreviations. How many people know what SL and SN stand for? If you do, it's because, right, we're catalogers. How many patrons do you think would know this? Probably very few. again, to a patron looking at the bibliographic record, this makes more sense than seeing SL, SN. There's no more rule of three. The rule of three, of course, is based on the idea that there's only a limited amount of space on a card catalog card. We have to limit the information that we provide. In a computer environment, you can put as much information into a record as we want. We are not limited by space. So if a book was produced by 4 co-authors, you have the option of either naming the first and then saying, and 3 others. It's one of the options described in RDA. Or you can, in fact, spell all of them out and give 700 entries for 3 of them and 1 to 100. No more rule of 3. And this is relevant for theological catalogers, there are no more testaments before biblical books. So when you create a record for a commentary on the book of Psalms, it is Bible Psalms instead of Bible OT Psalms. Bible Matthew rather than Bible MT Matthew. Unless, of course, you have a book specifically about the Old Testament or about the New Testament. If you have a textbook introduction to the Old Testament, the subject heading would be Bible Old Testament, not Bible OT. Again, abbreviations are to be avoided. Bible Old Testament or Bible New Testament. So testaments are still used in that context, but if we're dealing with a book on a particular book on the Bible, we would have the book immediately covered by it. Some more examples of what I was talking about, avoiding the use of abbreviations in particular. ACR2 would specify 4th ed, RDA would have 4th edition. Johnson Pub Co. is Johnson's publishing company. Instead of having 48 pages in square brackets, you have 48 unnumbered pages. It spells things out. This is based on another key principle in RDA, that's the convenience of the user. It's sometimes cited as sort of the prime directive in RDA, the convenience of the user. We spell things out because, again, the need for abbreviations is not as urgent in an environment where we're not limited to the space on a card catalog card. Oh yeah, and the SIG, ACR2 for SIG dummies, ACR2 for dummies. You would in fact spell it out and then offer a 246 field with the corrected title. Resource description. This is one of the bigger changes. Again, users will probably not see this, but this is something that catalogers will deal with. Macros can be set up for this, and have been, in fact, set up in OCLC connection, for example. AACR2 had GMDs, general material designations. You had subfield H, electronic resource, subfield H, microform, that sort of thing. In RDA, the title statement would not be interrupted by a general material designation. Instead, what you have are 3 different fields. In fact, only the first and the third of those are core, but it's usually good to include all 3. Content type, media type, and carrier type. I should have examples of these. Microform, electronic resource. In RDA, content type text. But you know, the content type text can be reflected in a print medium, in which case it would be called a volume, or it can be reflected in an online resource. If you have a scanned PDF document sort of breakdown was impossible with the GMD, which I think led to some of the confusion. Because we live in a very different, we work in a very different environment with different media, different carriers, multimedia. This sort of breakdown, more precise breakdown, is much, much more important. And I think this is, again, a huge advantage offered by RDA.
Just to point out, the much maligned Mark would have done exactly the same thing with your macro. If you had coded it properly, you'd have your text, you'd have your macroform versus computer. You're talking about a macro, writing a macro to take the 330 fields and put them into something. You could have written a macro to pull the information from the fixed fields. You might have had to do a bit of tweaking, a very small amount of tweaking of some of the fixed fields, but still, that information's all there. To tout this as an advantage of RDA is somewhat disingenuous. It's simply taking what was there, what we've been doing all along, putting it in a different place. It's not a replacement for the GMD solely. The GMD, of course, came later. It's that was the problem, that people used the GMD and attempted to instead of intelligently using what was already being coded, they stuck that in there. So subfield H versus the content types, yes, but subfield H was, it should never have been done. We should have forced the ILS vendors to use the fixed fields. And that's why when you talk about ILS vendors going and adapting themselves to this, I hope you're right. Their track record is not encouraging.
We'll have to see that.
Yeah.
I think part of the problem with the fixed fields is, we probably were our own worst enemy. I think a lot of catalogers felt they weren't being used and maybe have not always been coded correctly. And then I know, because I crosswalk mark data now, if things aren't coded correctly,
Right.
then those fixed fields, or that fixed field character is just useless. So I think having a more explicit element, and in XML we call it, a separate element, clearly a carrier medium content, I think would really be an improvement over the MARC structure. And then we're talking about data structure now, but I don't think we paid enough attention to the fixed fields.
Yeah, but see, that's you're putting it back on us. So we're going to still have to code this. So if we're going to train somebody, in a certain sense, go rap them on the knuckles for not doing what they were supposed to be doing. So I don't see this as one of the wonderful benefits.
Well, you do have more terms. You do have more codes that you can use, so you have a greater degree of granularity. For
I don't think
resources, you have it all.
with one or two exceptions, the fixed fields weren't full yet. The possibilities were not exhausted.
Again, that's true if things had always been done correctly, but you always have, a lot of derived records. Something is derived from another record, and again, errors creep in, they abound.
I don't see how a derived record, this is going to prove that. It's just going to be visually different. You're still going to have.
I think that'll make a difference, actually.
If you're careful, you're going to check. If you're not careful, you're not going to see it. I see what you're saying, but
Having done a lot of audiovisual cataloging over the years, the 007 fields, which are fixed field characters, standard codes, fixed length, they were a pain in the neck. I mean, you guys who do AV cataloging know they were a pain in the neck to fill out, or to create a macro, or I suppose but. I don't think we're limited to that kind of data structure anymore. I think MARC 21 was designed in a time period where maybe there was a limited storage of files or something. So you can only, have these single characters, and anyway, it was hard work to do those 007 fields.
Yes, I agree.
So another argument for maybe we need some kind of change. I don't know if this is it, but
if Lois was here, she'd remind you that you could create them and
You could
leave them there.
you could create macros.
She had macros.
Yeah. That's true.
My experience was that the workflow of establishing these fields was more straightforward, I think, than what I'd done cataloging the microfiche, for example. Finding the right code for depth of compression. I found it quite intuitive, or more intuitive, but again, yeah, it could be different.
And another point is, like, we want to break out of the library world, and we want developers and programmers to look at our records and be able to understand them. And they can't do that now because they don't understand Mark, and they really have to roll up their sleeves and study Mark to understand our data. And I don't think it really should be that way. I think we need better data structure. But we're getting off track a little bit, but it's somewhat related to this kind of thing.
It'll make talking to programmers or other metadata experts easier, I think. Yeah, I think that's true. It'll provide more of a shared vocabulary, or more mutually understandable vocabulary. I agree. All right. Authority data. There's greater importance of authority data in RDA. You have more relator terms and more relationship information may be expressed in bibliographic records. This is where you would see something in a 700 field, in a 740 field perhaps, adaptation of, if you look at the movie Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? You could include something like adaptation or parody of Homer, the Odyssey. And somebody who would like to access everything that has been done, including creative adaptations and parodies, everything that has been done on the Odyssey, somebody might want Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? To come. It's a great movie. This sort of thing was not possible with the ACR2. It is possible now. It creates relationships that were previously, I don't want to say impossible to create, but more difficult to create. And this has been one of the points of contention because some people say that it'll mess up the indexing. It'll mess up our indexes or locally controlled data.
That's why they dropped subfield E so many years ago. Subfield E was for relator terms.
Right.
Well, that's why they dropped it, because it messed up the indexing. So now we're bringing it back. All of the relator terms used to be in the index, not the same variety that RDA has introduced. But you used to have editor, compiler,
Right, for
joint author.
personal, yes, for personal.
Right, and so those were all there once upon a time.
Right. And
They've
have
taken out
continued
for
to be
exactly
used,
this
I think.
reason.
Certainly in the rare book cataloging world, those have continued to be used
Right.
For many years throughout. I use them quite frequently, actually, when I do rare book cataloging. That was limited really to personal names. But if you want to establish relationships between different works or different expressions, different manifestations, subfield high. Yeah. Allows more possibilities, I think. Let me talk about a couple of new fields that you can expect to see in bibliographic records. 257, country of producing entity. Again, I'm not sure how useful that particular one will be. The three main ones that people will see when they see RDA records, I'm sure you've all seen them in the OCLC, are the 336, 337, and 338. 380, form of work, or the genre designator can be added. Other distinguishing characteristics. A lot of additional fields are added for music catalogers. I don't catalog a lot of music, so I'm not quite as excited about those, but we had a music cataloger on our test group as part of the Emory RDA test, and she was quite ecstatic about these. And again, as I mentioned, 700 to 730, readership set 740, added entries have a new subfield I for relationship information. all these slides will be made available, so don't worry about writing down all these, all the codes. Sorry about that, I'm not sure why I did that. New information in bibliographic records. I talked about the Ferber model requiring more precise distinctions between elements. You remember the money screen that I had up, A's here, to having information relating to different elements of work, expression, manifestation, all of the 245. The Ferber model requires a more precise distinction between these elements, and these additional fields and subfields provide more granularity. Additional fields and subfields allow for a better definition of relationships between elements, and the increase of control indicators in field and subfield code provides more flexibility on opaque display, including language. You could have data, for example, in the 336, 337 fields, using an RDA term, which could show up as a book in an English language catalog and as thief in a French language. We would have that adaptability. Again, that's really a systems issue rather than a cataloging issue, but it, I think, opens up more possibilities of adapting our data for use in the system. You will see, at least in North American RDA records, I instead of A in the fixed fields, meaning it contains ISBD punctuation instead of A for ABC or 2. Elsewhere, most other US libraries will use code in I. Some new codes have been added. Let's move on. I realize we're running a little short here, so let me click through this because we've talked about these. Dissertation node. This is another one that I really quite like. When you're cataloging dissertations, currently the 502 field is a free text field, usually thesis, doctoral, Chicago, univ, and then the year. That seems to be the most standard way of representing it in free text. With RDA, you have, again, a much more granular breakdown of information for dissertations. You have the degree type that is given in a separate field. You have the name of the granting institution, the year granted, and it allows you to do a much more precise search for, say, all dissertations written at the University of Chicago in the year 2007. You might get some of the same results with simply a keyword search. But again, it's probably going to be much more imprecise. You have the dissertation identifier depending on the institution that granted dissertation. Yes, ma'am.
Did you say what the NR is?
Oh, sorry, non-repeatable.
Oh.
Non-repeatable or repeatable. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry about that. Again, I talked about this relationship information. I is used to identify relationship between entities described in 7xx and entity described in 145. There's control vocabulary found in RDA Appendix J. This is for 700 fields. Appendix I provides terms for relationships between works and expressions. So Appendix I would address things that would go into 740. Appendix J would address things that would go into 700 or 710. Personal as opposed to target. An example of this movie I talked about earlier, The Gospel According to St. Matthew, director, adaptation by Pier Pasolini, motion picture said motion picture adaptation of expression Bible, it would have been grouped under the same work Bible. If I considered the movie to be an expression rather than a separate work, I would consider it an adaptation of the expression Bible, Matthew, rather than the work Bible, Matthew. Yes?
Would certain catalogers do that?
Yes.
So there are
Yes. And again, the reason why I used Pasolini's movie is because it contains the exact text in Italian translation of the Gospel.
In Italian translation.
Right.
So it's
Which
not
is an
work,
expression.
it's an expression.
Right.
I still think the argument that you're making, the devil's advocate you're playing,
But the work exists at a level above translations.
except that Pasolini is using a particular translation.
Right. Good point. Yeah, did he work with the original text? Good point. Again, yeah. Good point. Again, it becomes dicey here, and it is possible to see different interpretations of that. Cataloger's judgment certainly will always has played a part and will continue to play a part. True. New fields and authority records allows for greater specification of information about a person, including address. I don't think this, oh yeah, it is in here, 371, the address. Some people have raised some confidentiality issues. If you know the address of a person, you can actually put it in an authority record. I'm not sure you want to do that. Gender was one that French catalogers insisted on. I don't know why, but it is good to know that even Lenoir is a man and George Sand was a woman. Just to remove those ambiguities, there certainly are cases where this would have to be specified, affiliation or occupation. These informations are often contained in the 670 fields in authority records. Again, they can be spelled out very clearly.
Are these going to be repeatable?
Yes.
Are these searchable as, like if you wanted works only written by men, would the gender be valuable for that, or this is not, this, you know what I mean?
Well, this would be an authority record, not
Right, I
a
understand,
bibliographic
but
record.
would there be any use, is there any way that would work, or no?
For a user, no.
Okay.
No, I don't think so. Because I'm not aware of a way to make that work, but I guess possibly you could. I hadn't thought of it. That's good.
Is there research just on it?
Well, it doesn't have to be included. Those are fields that can be included, it doesn't have to be. So again, you wouldn't necessarily have comprehensive search results. Yes.
What's the difference between field activity and occupation?
Field of activity can be much broader. Somebody who writes about quantum physics would go in the field of activity. Occupation would be research professor at MIT, for example. Yes.
I would think address would really raise confidentiality issues of the I would not want.
It does, yes. Again, it depends on how specific you want to be. I'm not sure if the street address needs to be included, but if the back of the book says this person lives in London, England, London, England.
That's associated
Could be.
place.
Well, associated place can also be where the person published, or yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure I would want to use it. It is possible to use it, but again, cataloger's judgment perhaps in this case should be on to. Good point. So the toolkit. I think we are actually out of time. Shall we go on to look at the toolkit a little bit more? Or?
Yeah. Okay. Few more, I see what time
Okay, good. As I mentioned, the print edition is available at ALA Publishing. It's $150. Not terribly useful, I don't think, because it's not a linear resource, and really shouldn't. Again, it's like reading the full cover to cover to use it. You don't have to do that. The online toolkit can be accessed at RDA.org. It requires a subscription. There are different price levels depending on how many consecutive subscribers should be able to access the toolkit. You'll find that the contents are hierarchically structured. You see 3 tabs: RDA, tools, and resources. RDA is the actual resource. RDA, what you would find in the print edition. And you can expand any of these, anything with a plus. For example, important attributes of, and then again, expand that further. And then this is an actual example. RDA 171. This is the rule that you can cite general guidelines on transcription. The individual entries are actually shorter than individual entries you would find in AACR2, which I think makes it more usable. However, it contains more links. Like, do this as here, if relevant. You would click around. In AACR2, that's not really all that usable because you have a print resource. And you don't want to flip pages back and forth. In an online environment, this is a lot easier. One of the most useful features of the RDA toolkit is what is called tools. I love it. Used it a lot in the tech.
I laugh.
Oh, sorry. You have mappings, how to adapt RDA to different formats, mapping Mark, for example. If you want to use Mark, if you are trying to construct a 300 field, what RDA rules are relevant to that? Click on that, it'll expand it. It's just a different way of accessing the information, but if you're working in a Mark environment, this is very useful. You can create workflows, and you can customize them locally. This can be very helpful. You can establish a workflow. If you're cataloging an audio CD, this is what you do. These are the RDA fields that you want to look at. If you're training catalogers in your departments, this can be very, very useful. An example, Mark bibliographic to RDA mapping. I think it's 245. It's hard to see from my angle here. Oh no, it's the 100. And it lists all the different entries on RDA relating to 100A, 100D, 100C. How would you describe that? What are the relevant rules for that? I find this very usable. Example for shared workflows, cataloging and print serial. You can establish shared workflows, you can set it up, open it up to others, or use other people's workflows. So you don't have to do the work over again or use what's usable for your own purposes. Other resources, AACR2 is actually included in RDA. And I think that's a good thing, because all of us have learned to catalog in AACR2. It's the environment we're most familiar with, and it's good to refer back and forth. Catalogs desktop, I think, is in here as well. Policy standards. Yes?
I was just wondering, is the RDA connected to AACR2, so if you want to look up the comparison?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you can make that transition very easily. Free resources. This is quite helpful, I think, especially if you have only the print edition and you don't want to spend the money on the online subscription. A couple of resources are in fact freely accessible. You don't have to log in to use these, particularly the table of contents and the index. You can search the RDA index for free. I'll show you an example. This is the table of contents, I believe. No, this is the starting page for the RDA toolkit. You log in. Click on introduction. It'll expand the table of contents. You won't be able to read the actual rules. For those, you would have to have a subscription, but the table of contents is available for free and is printable. More useful is the index. You can search the index for a particular issue. So if you only have the print edition, for example, and there's a particular point that you're trying to find out, but you don't quite know how to find it in the print edition, you can search the index and it'll take you directly to the relevant number, which then you can look up. Yeah. You can consult the printed indexes, I suppose. But, again, it's a different way of accessing the information. And that brings me to the end of this presentation. Are there any more questions? Okay, then thank you very much. And I'll be watching at the end.
We will be having the business meeting in room 3, and the afternoon session in room 3 as well.
Yeah, there will be some time. They go together, but I realize the second was important.